I'm currently in Vancouver's Downtown Eastside, which has one of the highest rates of addiction, mental illness, and homelessness in North America. And as an ER doctor, I treat people from this community every single day on the job. I'm going to be meeting up with Dale, who has personally struggled with addiction, became sober, and has spent the last 4 years of his life working in the heart of the Downtown Eastside, serving this community. And I am going to hear his story. We're going to be talking about a bunch of different topics. And I do want to offer a trigger warning that some of these topics are going to include mental illness, trauma, violence, PTSD, which can be quite triggering for some viewers. Hey, Dale? Hey, great to see you. So thanks so much for sitting down with me. Maybe we can just start with your story. I'm curious to hear, what your life was like before addiction and kind of what drugs you started with and how this all happened.
Yeah, so there's Dale, obviously. I'm from Vancouver. My childhood up until, let's call it age 12, was pretty normal. My parents, I was born to divorced parents. So I grew up with both two sets of parents, effectively. I got double duty, dad and stepmom, and then mom and stepfather and such. And things were honestly pretty normal. I was diagnosed with dyslexia as a kid. And so that was obviously something I had to go through. I ended up going to special schooling and all this kind of stuff. But generally speaking, things were pretty normal. And then in 2007, one of my parents ended up getting cancer. And it ended up being pancreatic cancer, which, as you probably know as a doctor, is not a good diagnosis, bad. Yeah. So they ended up passing within about a one year, 9-month period, kind of from starting to be kind of off to literally passing away. So I ended up spending my kind of grade 7 year, a lot of times at the hospital and in hospice and all that kind of stuff. And that was also around the same sort of time. So I was 12, 13 through that period. And that was the same sort of time that I started experimenting with substances as well. I have a hard time looking back and seeing this was the thing that, caused me to use or make these sorts of decisions. But I think it's pretty clear that sort of really severe shift and the kind of trauma, if you want to call it that, of watching a parent pass away and all the kind of other stuff that goes along with the kind of family drama and degradation and instability that goes along with all that. I think as a youth I saw substances as kind of a way out of that, as an escape effectively in some kind of way. We're around, fortunately or unfortunately, around that age is when a lot of people start experimenting. And I was very, I've told people the story before, I was very self-motivated, kind of funnily enough. A lot of people talk about things peer pressure or whatever, right? And I never really experienced that. I was never the kind of in a situation where people were pushing drugs on me or whatever. I was always very interested and curious to try the next thing and kind of push the envelope. And so it started with pot, but very quickly developed into, trying all sorts of other substances and basically doing whatever I could get my hands on. And always kind of asking, dealers or people, what else do they have? Do they know other people? All these kinds of things. My school and social life through most of that time was actually okay. I always did pretty well in school. Even though I was, probably stoned at the time and all that kind of stuff. But really the big sort of shift was when I was 17 or turning 16, 17. I was in quite a severe car crash. And then I started using opioids after that car crash. And that, I had used opioids previously, but it was very inconsistent. I'd buy Percocets from someone here or there, or that was back in the time of oxycodone and stuff like that, as you're probably familiar with, right? You buy oxys or whatever from people on the street or from dealers, but it was relatively inconsistent. And then there was a pretty sharp shift after that accident that pushed me into using opioids heavily, and which became almost exclusively within the course of probably just a couple months. So going from being a very kind of polysubstance user, kind of hippie kid, almost smoking weed, psychedelics, all that kind of stuff, to to using primarily opioids, which went from very quickly from things like oxycodone to heroin primarily.
Okay.
And now this would have been, we're looking at sort of 2012 area here, 2013. So I was using heroin, and eventually I was using heroin IV, and again, all that kind of stuff was very much pursued at my own interest. No one taught me anything, or no one pushed me to do it. I was just kind of like, this is sort of what you do from the movies or media, right? Like if you're doing down is a street name for heroin, if people don't know, or any sort of opioid at this point. You obviously use needles or whatever, so kind of like going that sort of path. Very quickly though, like opioids and heroin specifically really took over my life entirely. As probably I'm sure you and your viewers would not be surprised by, like heroin addiction is like very severe.
Yeah.
Obviously if you're, doing injecting and all that kind of stuff. And, it really took over my kind of whole mind and body and psyche and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And what ended up happening is effectively a multi-year period from kind of 17 to about 20, so about 4 years of using heroin and occasionally other opioids, and basically shifting in and out of youth detoxes, youth treatment centers, youth reform programs. So I'd be at a reform program for like 4 or 5 months out in the country somewhere, and then I'd come back, and then I'd be using again for 6 months, and then I'd be out again at some center for 2 months, and then I'd be back, and so there was this seesaw of kind of in and out of systems, and then relapse, and social workers, and relapse, and all this kind of stuff. And so that was really what that addiction kind of looked like up until I was about 20.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I often ask a lot of people that I treat in the ER who come in with substance use disorder, whether it's just like purely opioids or a mix.
Yeah.
A lot of it is like crystal meth is what I'm
totally.
seeing these days. But I often ask them how they became addicted. And
Yeah.
I feel like most of the stories that I hear are kind of like 3 different things. The first one is like escaping trauma.
Yeah.
Second one is, they got addicted after they were prescribed pain medications for, some kind of injury that they had.
Yep.
And then the third one, which I often feel is kind of like a very sad method, is people try drugs because of like the party scene. Like oftentimes it's stimulants like cocaine, and then they are kind of chasing that high. Go from cocaine to crystal meth, and then start getting introduced to opiates. But it sounds like your story kind of has a blend of all different 3.
Yeah, I would say it's a blend of all 3. I mean, I think it would primarily be like the trauma. I think looking back, losing a parent and kind of having that, sort of radical shift from a very normal, quite stable familial life, even though it was, divorced parents and all that kind of stuff, I was pretty used to it, to, being faced with kind of, mortality and all the trauma around losing a parent and all the kind of other stuff. I think that was like the primary starter. And then I also think, as you said, like the accident, and obviously I was prescribed opioids after the accident, and I had already had some affiliation with them, and obviously already had substance use issues. And so those really, I think that really just kind of like took off from there. And I am kind of, my story is a little bit unique. I wouldn't say wholly unique, but it's a little bit unique in that you mentioned like most people, as well as I've known, would have some level of polysubstance use, right? Oftentimes it'd be opioids with things like meth or opioids and coke or whatever together, where I was really primarily just an opioids person. Like that was really all that I did.
What was it about opiates that drew you to it, compared to other things?
I think the primary thing now, like looking back, was that they just made you feel like, okay, cool, calm, collected. And like, we'll get into this, I'm sure, but like, my using dovetailed with the beginning of the fentanyl crisis, right? So when I was using actual heroin and stuff like that, and morphine a little bit and all these sorts of things. And there's also a certain degree in which those sorts of drugs also feel more functional. As you know, that might sound kind of strange, but you know, if you're high on heroin, especially if you're used to it, or morphine or whatever, like you don't necessarily always feel that messed up.
Okay.
Like you just feel like you feel good, you feel cool, you feel calm. But you know, your ability to like go out and do stuff and talk to people and socialize and all this kind of sorts of things, you know, like they aren't necessarily as interrupted as something like, you know, if you're on like meth or whatever, it's like quite apparent that you're like on methamphetamine.
Were you still able to like work during that time when you were addicted?
So I was in school for some time during that period. Eventually I dropped out, and that really has to do less with like the actual being intoxicated component and more that like I had to devote most of my time and energy to getting substances. And so that became, and that was primarily through things like, you know, like petty, you know, effectively petty crime. Like, or, you know, I did have some jobs and stuff like that, but it would be, you know, like either selling my own items or, you know, stealing iPods from a gym locker room or whatever it might be, right? Like these sorts of small, I never engaged in any like really serious criminal offenses, but like that was kind of, you know, a sort of classic thing if you're like a teenager and you don't have money and you're trying to like buy like drugs daily, right? You gotta like do what you gotta do. And so it became a very all-consuming thing. And then on top of that as well, the aspect of being in and out of like centers as well also really interrupted my education and schooling and stuff like that, because it's kind of hard to be, you know, at school when you've been like, you know, when you're suddenly, you know, living and attending some, you know, like youth reform camp in the middle of the province or whatever as well, right? So
you were really, it sounds like you were kind of stuck in that cycle where it's like you're high, then you're going into withdrawal, then you're trying to like search to get the drug So, and you really felt like when you weren't using, you were actually actively going into opiate withdrawal?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, like that, you know, I think it's kind of funny because when I look back, I think my first probably 6 months or so of using heroin like every day, it's almost like I wasn't fully aware that I was like addicted to heroin. I was just kind of automated, and also too I was, you know, 17 years old or whatever too.
Jeez, that's really young, eh?
Yeah, it's quite young.
Were you kind of like one of the youngest people in the?
Unfortunately, no.
No, okay.
No. So, but like, yeah, like so it. Sorry, what was the original question?
Talking about the cycle of like.
So in terms of like things like withdrawal and stuff like that, it took me a few months to really realize like what was going on. Like I would start to feel ill, and I would just get really bad cravings, and it was almost like living like kind of robotically, right? Like you're kind of like you start living like instinctually, like I just have to operate this way because I'm not feeling well, I'm not okay, and I just know that like, you know, if I use, I'll feel better, right? And so you like exactly like you said, like caught in that cycle repetitively. But it actually took me a while to realize that, like, to have some awareness that was actually what was going on.
Okay.
But I was very much, I think it probably only took a couple weeks, if that, of using to be in a state where I was physically addicted to opiates. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like it happens quite quickly.
How much were you using per day? And
it's you know, it's hard to say because it was it's over 10 years now, but I would say that there was definitely a period where I'd be using, you know, between half a gram to a gram streetwise, kind of daily, would probably be the average.
What is that? Oh, is that quite?
It would be
average,
like,
or?
Yeah, that would be.
What does that equate to? Like, is that like injecting like 2-3 times a day or something like that?
Usually would be multiple times a day. It's, you know, again, I have to think back because it's been a long time, but it was probably you'd spend anywhere from about $100 to $200 a day. Wow. Was kind of like the benchmark for, you know, like what it took to feel okay and all that kind of stuff. Now, like, as I kind of said, like my using sort of the end of my using dovetailed with fentanyl and the introduction of fentanyl, and that's really different because fentanyl is so much more potent, right? So like the amounts that people are actually using in many times is like not as much.
Yeah.
You know, like if you were doing a gram of fentanyl versus a gram of heroin, like you would die.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you would die,
Yeah.
like for sure.
Yeah.
Right. So that really, like, what, in terms of like if you're talking to people now on the street, like in terms of like kind of what amounts and stuff they're using, that would probably, like a half a gram would sound like a lot.
Yeah.
But back then, for like the kind of classic, you call it like heroin era, that would probably be a pretty standard like level of like a daily heroin addict kind of person.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you ever try fentanyl?
Yeah, so I tried fentanyl once or twice. I know I tried it one time, like for sure, like not with my own knowledge. Funny enough, there was a period where I was in and out there back when I was young. There was a youth detox center. It's not around anymore, but I was a regular patron there at that youth detox. There was a period probably where I was there almost every week or two.
Wow.
I remember talking to other, young people that were there. So it was for people between the ages of, I believe, 13 and 21 or something like that. And they would talk about how there was this new like chemical heroin that's like 100 times stronger, and is like has way worse withdrawals and all this kind of stuff. And looking back now, I realize that they were talking about fentanyl. That was probably about 2012, 2013.
Okay.
So that was really like the very beginnings of fentanyl started to come on the scene as this like alternative to heroin. And then there was like right near the end of my using, there was a time where I was looking for drugs or whatever, and someone said they had fentanyl, and so that's what I used.
Yeah.
And it was quite different than heroin, like in terms of if you're talking about like the aesthetic experience of like what a high or intoxication is like. Fentanyl was considerably more inebriating in a way than heroin was. Yeah.
So apart from it being inebriating, like what else can you tell me about the experience?
It's so I found that fentanyl like caused myself like to black out a lot more.
Did you ever overdose?
Yeah, I did. I did on heroin, and it's possible that I did overdose. I had quite a severe overdose one time. I overdosed a couple times where I ended up going to the hospital and all that kind of stuff, administered Narcan. And one of those times was very severe. And I don't have the details, I don't know, but I think it's entirely possible that was actually fentanyl.
Okay.
In terms of like, I ended up being in the hospital for about 3 or 4 days, and they were concerned about, things about like brain damage and stuff like that, because of the, the severity of the OD and such. But I think it's entirely possible that was actually fentanyl that when I OD'd that time.
That was an injection or smoking?
Injection.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe.
Yeah.
But fentanyl was considerably more like much more of a sedative in a way, and much more like kind of like blacking out, memory loss, like just kind of in and out of consciousness effectively. Versus like something like heroin or morphine or these kind of more classic traditional opioids that had almost more, it sounds weird to say, but more of like a cleaner, clearer sort of feeling. Okay. Like cognitively, you didn't feel as like inebriated or out of it, whereas fentanyl was very like intense, very strong, but not necessarily as euphoric. Is the odd kind of combination, not necessarily as like much as like I feel really good, I feel really calm. It was just more like you're really messed up from the dose or whatever.
What was it like waking up in the hospital? Because I mean, like, as an ER doctor, I treat people from the downtown Eastside, people that overdose literally every single day, multiple times a day. So maybe walk me through what it's like to wake up and how have a doctor.
I had two very different experiences. So one experience was a very severe overdose. I frankly can't remember what the details were in terms of the medical concerns. I know I was deaf for about like a day afterwards.
Deaf?
Yeah,
like you couldn't hear anything?
Yeah, I couldn't hear anything, yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. And there was some other medical concerns and stuff, and then everything ended up being okay, I hope. But that experience was very people were very like attentive and caring. I ended up, being moved. Like I said, I spent multiple days in the hospital, all this kind of stuff. There was another time where I OD'd. I can't remember which time was first, to be honest, but where it was much more of what I expect the standard experience to be like, where, I woke up on the ground, actually not too far from here, to be honest, and, with paramedics and police around me.
They had Narcaned you?
Yeah, they had Narcaned me. They took me to the hospital, and then basically the doctors told me, actually, I remember the exact conversation with the doctors were like, well, you know what I'm going to tell you? And I said, I'm going to say, I need to stop using. And he was like, oh, no, not like, I'm not expecting that. You just like, don't use alone. So, and then basically they just they were like, you're good to go, and I left.
Wow.
So I was probably in and out of the hospital within about an hour and a half, 2 hours of that experience. Yeah.
So I've had that conversation with many people as well. How does that hit as like someone that is drug addicted? Like for a doctor to have a harm reduction approach where it's like, no, you don't have to stop using, but just use in a safer way.
I think, for myself at that time, right, like I was trying, like I had been in and out of trying to get off drugs and all that kind of stuff. So if I'm being honest, it felt kind of hopeless having a doctor sort of say, it was almost with the tone of like, I'm not expecting you to stop. Wow. Like I'm just saying like just use more safely next time.
Yeah.
Which was kind of like not the most, in a sense, encouraging. However, I also recognize that like, that is in some ways probably a more realistic conversation to have with certain people at certain times, right? In terms of, a lot of times, like, people are going to overdose, and like the reality is that in most cases, those sorts of people who a doctor is seeing, they are going to use again. The chances are they are going to use again. And so having those conversations are really, important in terms of emphasizing safe use. But it also definitely felt disheartening not being able to, kind of feel like, the expectations felt low in terms of like what the doctor was expecting me to be to do, right?
Yeah.
But that could have also been from my own personal mindset in terms of where I was at, right?
Yeah, I guess like when people have an overdose, it's usually like a major event, right? Like waking up in the hospital, and I feel like a lot of the times I try to frame that as like, okay, like someone's coming in crisis. This is one potential opportunity to like turn their life around and like offer other, resources and opportunities to get out of that cycle. Yep. So oftentimes, like we're offering things like going to the addictions clinic to get into Detox, getting on some kind of opioid agonist therapy like Suboxone or Methadone. And I think a lot of it is kind of gauging where someone is in that kind of like the stages of change, whether they're like pre-contemplative or contemplative, But you're right. Like that is something that is very commonly practiced among doctors.
And I also think too, like we gotta remember, like this was over, this was over 10 years ago, right? So I think like the conversations that doctors are gonna have now, and I know this from experience from my work and stuff like that, like they look different, like they look more comprehensive. Yeah. Like that conversation happened probably, I think that would have been probably 2014. So that's like very, like right at the beginning of this sort of opioid crisis, fentanyl crisis. And so I think a lot of the language, but also a lot of like the supports and structures around all that kind of stuff just wasn't even necessarily there. Like I think that was like the beginning of people trying to figure out, how do we deal with this sort of crisis? And the simplest thing of like, well, don't use alone is, like advice that saves lives every day, for sure.
Can you walk me through what it's like to go into withdrawal? Like, what does that feel like? And
yeah, for sure.
Like, is there one particular instance where you had really, really bad withdrawal?
No, they all kind of sort of blend together. But I would describe it as, it really sucks.
Yeah.
Like it's really,
it's probably an understatement.
It's really unpleasant. It's a really unpleasant experience. Basically, it feels like having a really severe, potentially fatal flu like you know, you feel like you're gonna die. The symptoms are very similar to like some sort of like influenza, flu type thing, where it's like, you know, fever, sweating. Some people might be throwing up or diarrhea, unable to. I would have very bad insomnia.
Yeah.
So I'd be like awake for days, just completely unable to sleep. So you're having all these sorts of symptoms of like, you know, basically feel like you're dying. And then on top of that, you also have the mental side of it, where you're having very strong cravings. You're having like the kind of like the voices, the psychological aspect of the addiction in your head talking, you know, you kind of feel like, you know, there's a way to end this, to get out of this feeling. So you're simultaneously dealing with feeling so ill that it feels like you're going to die, while also, you know, having cravings for and knowing about this substance that can get rid of this feeling. So you're constantly being pulled by these two sorts of forces. So it's very, it's really, really, really an unpleasant experience, and I certainly don't recommend it to anybody.
Yeah.
In my case, I would find that generally I would last about a week to 10 days. Now, different substances and different people, like it really can range. I know some people it's like experience a few days, and especially with other types of opiates, some people have symptoms that last over a month. And there is also, you know, kind of longer term withdrawal symptoms that people can describe as well. But I would say for me, most of the time, it was sort of like I expect kind of like a week-ish zone where I was going to be like completely out before I started to feel sort of more normal again.
Okay. Were you ever homeless?
Not to the point that I was sleeping on the street, but there were times where I was like staying with friends or staying with people. Yeah, effectively. Yeah.
Yeah, what was that like?
Not necessarily the greatest, because like a lot of times if you're going to be in that sort of situation, you're going to be around people who are also using or have other like issues, whether that be like mental health or behavioral or whatever. You know, it's not like I wasn't like couch surfing with my grandma. You know what I mean? So it also feels like deeply destabilizing, because, you know, you don't feel like you have like a home or a place to really go or a place that really feels safe for you. And so, yeah, like that was, I never got to the point where I personally was living on the street, but that was sort of near right at the end when I finally stopped using, where I was kind of like, you know, staying with like some, you know, kind of shadier people or whatever, and sleeping on couches and doing all that kind of stuff. That was, also certainly not like ideal at all.
One thing that I try to explain to people over social media is kind of like the psychosocial aspects of addiction. It's not just like that you're like physically dependent on the drugs, but it's like, there is that biological component, but, you know, as you've kind of alluded to, there is the psychological component where there's like the two different forces that are like drawing you. You have the cravings and you're like actively going out to seek it out. And then the last one is the social, like if you're completely immersed in that kind of environment, like everyone around you is using, and that in itself kind of like sucks you right back into the addiction, even if you want to get out.
Right? And that's one of the biggest things that really happens. And, you know, and I'm glad that, you know, my history with that and my life started to change around like 1920, because, you know, the deeper you go into the sort of social world, and that becomes, you know, it becomes your life. It becomes, you know, it is a lifestyle, right? It is a social world. It is, people do build like real connections, all that kind of stuff there. And if that's who you know and how you know, and like the world you know how to operate in, and where you're comfortable and where your supports are, even if, you know, those supports might be like questionable or whatever, then it's really hard to leave that stuff behind, right? And a lot of times that's all that people have. They only have that is their social world. So to say like, I'm just going to completely exit that, you know, then it's like, you know, where do you go from there, right? Especially if you don't have family supports, or you don't have other friends or whatever it might be, then you're kind of alone, right? And that's certainly not, the feeling of being alone is certainly not a feeling of like being conducive to, you know, recovery or being healthy or whatever it might be.
Tell me about what it was like with your like friendships and your family members, because I guess a lot of people definitely wouldn't know this, but the way that I was connected with you was through your mom. Like your mom's my next door neighbor, lovely lady. She's like definitely I think she knows this as well,
Yeah.
but she's definitely the favorite person in that neighborhood, and I spend a lot of time chatting with her.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how I knew about your story, because she would kind of share tidbits about that. But what was your relationship like with your mom and with your friends during that time?
So I got I would say I got very lucky in the sense of, like, I had part of the reason that a major reason that I'm here today, and that, we're able to talk like this and have these sorts of discussions, is because, I had a certain level of family support. They didn't want to enable me at a certain point and all that kind of stuff, but my family was always supportive in trying to help me, get on the right track or get off drugs or whatever it might be. And so they were really great about all that kind of stuff, and they're a big reason that I'm here today. Another thing is that I was kind of a loner in terms of my using, which is obviously not safe because of using alone. But I never built, I certainly knew people and had some loose friendships, but I never built a really close, network of, using friends and people and stuff like that. I was always kind of like a ghost, or just someone who was around on their own, or
Why was
occasionally
that?
meet people.
Is that just personality? Or?
I think personality, and maybe I had some inclination that I didn't want to get too sucked into that world. I mean, I certainly saw and experienced some things as you're kind of on the periphery and starting to hang out with people, and I kind of, the more you kind of cycle in and get get connected and become a part of all that kind of stuff, the deeper you are and the more enmeshed you become, and the harder it is to get out, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there was maybe some component of me realizing that and knowing that, and just wanting to I just wanted to get high and feel okay and do my own thing and not be too much a part of the using world.
Yeah.
And that, I'm very lucky that was the case.
One common story that I hear with people that are drug addicted with their families, because sometimes I do get families that bring in people because they want to get into detox, is that it's so psychologically hard on the family members, and the people that are drug addicted keep coming to the family members trying to get money from them, stealing objects from their homes.
Sure.
And that ultimately leads to the family cutting the people off. Did that never happen with you?
I mean, it happened to the degree that I was cut off to the degree that it was we don't want anything to do with you unless it involves you going to treatment, right? Unless it involves supporting you in some obviously healthy way, but we're not gonna give you money, or we're not gonna support your addiction or whatever, right? And I think that I'm very grateful that was the sort of line that they took and the way that they operated, because it did allow me to when I inevitably did go to treatment over the times, I did, it was a multi-stage process, but they were always willing to help with that, and and kind of guide me through those processes on some level, which was huge. But they would not enable, or I got kicked out of my home, family homes and all that kind of stuff, right? For exactly the kind of behaviors you're describing, and that is why a lot of people get cut off, right? Is because they're when you're in that level of addiction, you really do have a tunnel vision. Like I said before, it feels like you're like a robot, or kind of like an automaton. You're not fully cognitively there. You're so singularly focused on just using, that everything else becomes kind of like a blur, and the concern, ethical concerns or familial concerns or social concerns or health concerns, all that kind of stuff just doesn't really matter. And if you're if you've got that kind of tunnel vision, then there's not really a lot to be done, unless there's moments where you can maybe break out of that.
Let's move on to talking about how you got clean, because I think this is something that I'm really fascinated about, how you were able to turn your life around. Was it one instance where you're you hit rock bottom and you wanted to get clean, or what was that process?
No, it's multi-stage. Like I said, I went through multiple kind of youth centers and stuff like that. And I think like looking back, it was like a sort of stepping stone each kind of way up. You know, like going from being like completely unaware, is almost like not even realizing that I had an addiction, being in some level of like denial, is what people would say, to you know, to being aware but not being really aware what to do with it, to like starting to know what some of the tools and supports are, but not really knowing how to use them, and then you relapse again, and then you start to learn how to use those supports, and eventually, like in the, you know, going to treatment centers and stuff like that. And eventually I did move away from Vancouver and ended up in a completely different city, a completely different community that had quite a large like recovery community associated with it and all that kind of stuff, and really just immersed myself in that social world. And I think that was one of the biggest shifts, like one of the main things that happened, as you kind of talk about the biopsychosocial. It's like, you know, I removed myself from like the environments that I was familiar with, and then at the same time started to build up new social networks, new friends, new relationships, all that kind of stuff, new hobbies, interests, jobs, eventually school, all these sorts of things that I like cared about, that sort of hung together as a life that I actually wanted to like pursue and had motivation to like continue on with and not basically like screw up. And so I like that's effectively how that kind of like built up over time. And yeah, and I just sort of when I finally stopped using opioids and all that kind of stuff, and like stopped heroin, I ended up living in like a men's. It was not an official recovery house, but like a men's like kind of like sober home, where it was a bunch of younger guys who were all kind of on the same track as me, and we all lived together as roommates. And I lived there for like a couple of years actually, or probably about a year and a half, almost close to 2 years. And, you know, built really close relationships, close friendships. And that was like a huge, like essential part of like that whole process for sure.
So when you were, because you mentioned a couple times that you were kind of in and out of like youth detox centers, what were those detox centers like? And I guess like I also want you to touch on what kind of resources were helpful and which ones weren't helpful.
So the like youth detox was certainly helpful. It was very harm reduction focused, but they were very supportive. I went to multiple centers. Some of the centers were terrible. Like they were like very like they were poorly run. They were staffed by people who were not, you know, their training and knowledge and certification was certainly not adequate. They didn't really know what they were doing, and it was, you know, just very chaotic, and inevitably like some of those centers actually were shut down and stuff like that. And then I also went to other treatment centers that were very, they were quite good, right? And they employed people who were, you know, certified counselors and had, you know, doctors on staff or psychiatrists on staff, and had a more, you know, structured, holistic, and like functioning program. You know, the recovery world and all that kind of, and treatment and all that kind of stuff I think it's changing now, but there's been a lot of discussion about it. It's a little bit Wild West in terms of like opening centers and what recovery is and what recovery treatment actually means and looks like. And so there's a lot of different, I guess you could say, styles and stuff out there. And some of them are like pretty, in my opinion, be pretty questionable in terms of like what they're actually doing. And some places are very well, you know, do take a much more scientific and like, you know, evidence-based approach in terms of what a treatment actually should be.
So if you were, I mean, like you have worked with many people that are drug addicted who have wanted to get clean. Like what's your typical advice to help these people get sober?
I think it really like begs a different question, like to me, or sort of begs the question of like who am I talking to? Because like unfortunately that answer is really dependent on like the person that I'm having the conversation with. Like if I'm talking with someone who has strong familial support, strong, like, you know, is in a relatively okay, say families or families in an okay financial position, you know, all this kind of stuff. They don't have other mental health issues, whatever it might be. Then, you know, the answer might be something like, you know, okay, well, if you've got a severe addiction, like here's like a good, well-certified treatment center. Can you get in there? Can you get on the waiting list? You know, are there ways that you can afford it, either through family or, you know, other kind of grants, bursaries, programs, whatever it might be. You know, but that answer isn't necessarily going to work for someone who is, say, you know, living on the street with no supports, also dealing with mental health issues, might have also very well have, you know, some very serious physical health issues as well.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of times those sorts of individuals have been through treatment many, many times before as well, right? So I think the answer is really dependent, unfortunately, on like the person and what their actual issues they're dealing with. I think like one simple suggestion I would make would be environmental. Like, I think there's a huge thing for me, which is like, if you're able, right, like, you know, stop hanging out with people who are, you know, stop hanging out with your using friends. If you can, like, you know, if the whole city is a trigger, if the whole town is a trigger, then like leave, right? Like, don't, like, change the environment. Like that, a lot of times is a big enough of a shift for people to sort of start fresh and for things to change significantly. So that's like one of the like the most primary pieces of, like, you know, advice I would give to someone is like, can you really change your environment and your social world up like pretty significantly? And some people can and some people can't. But in terms of like furthering treatment and all that kind of stuff, it's so dependent on like the person and like what they're dealing with, because like, you know, like trying to send someone to like even like a good treatment center, you know, if they're also dealing with psychosis and, you know, severe health issues and have severe behavioral problems or whatever it might be, or maybe they just can't afford it or whatever, right? Like, then the answer is going to look totally different, because it's like some doors, some options, some opportunities are just not there, or aren't realistic.
Have you ever tried one of those 12-step programs like Narcotics Anonymous?
Yeah, so I don't like consider myself like I'm a member of like any kind of 12-step programs anymore, but there was a multi-year period where I was like quite involved. And like people will ask me like what was it that like was really good about them or whatever. I'm not going to comment too much on like whether or not I think 12-step is like, you know, the way to go or not. There are certainly some people who are very like zealous about 12-step, and there are certainly some people who are very dismissive. What I think was most essential for me, though, in that kind of early year period, first few years being off drugs and all that kind of stuff, being away from heroin, etc., was the social aspect of 12-step meetings and all that kind of thing.
Oh, true.
Right? Like I was in an area where there was a lot of meetings, and there was a lot of younger people at those meetings and stuff like that as well. And so I think the most important point really was the social community that I built from attending those meetings, rather than any of the actual like structural teachings or doctrines of the actual programs themselves. It was more the social aspect for sure that was important.
And did you ever try any like opioid agonist therapy to get clean? Or okay. So.
Yeah. So I did Suboxone, but it was a very early on. And I don't believe they do it this way anymore. But at a treatment center, I did a Suboxone taper, but it was a rapid taper. So the taper was like 21 days, I believe 21 days long, and it was basically like they started me at a dose, and then over the course of like 3 weeks, just sort of like slammed the dose down to zero.
Very rapidly.
Very rapid. Oh yeah.
Interesting.
It was super rapid.
Do they still do that?
I don't think that's a thing anymore.
Okay.
Like I haven't heard about that. Again, that would have been 2014, so that was kind of the beginning of that sort of era, and the introduction of things like Suboxone and stuff as well. And yeah, so it was this very sort of like rapid taper idea. And as far as I know, that's not really a thing that anyone does anymore, because it was quite, I remember like it was effective, but at the end, like I definitely remember the last few days like getting quite ill.
It was
like,
super rough.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Like you suddenly go into like withdrawal again for a few days, and you're kind of like, oh, like, you know. And so I think that there's the Suboxone is used now over much more of a kind of long-term replacement therapy idea, which I think is probably better.
Yeah. One of the most admirable things about your story is, you went from addiction to sobriety, and you took yourself out of that environment, but then you put yourself right back in that environment to work in the downtown east side, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I should say it's not like there was a period of years to get there, but pretty quickly on from like getting clean and like getting off heroin, all that kind of stuff, I started going to university, and then I also started working in the mental health field. And I actually started by volunteering with the suicide hotline and the crisis line and stuff like that in my area. And so I was a volunteer there for some time. And then I actually ended up getting a job as an employee working as a suicide hotline, crisis line worker. And I worked there for about a year. So that was my first sort of job in the mental health field. And then from there, I ended up working at a treatment center and at like an abstinence-based, pretty well-regarded medicalized treatment center. And I worked there for about 4 or 5 years, eventually working up into a kind of semi-counselor. I was kind of the weekend supervisor of the second stage program. So the way a lot of treatment centers will work, especially some of the bigger, more organized ones, is they'll have multiple stages, right? So there'll be like an inpatient stage where you're usually anywhere from like a month to 2 months, usually, sometimes 3, where you're like live in a facility and you don't leave. Wow. And you're in the facility the whole time, and you're in treatment. And then a lot of times what they'll have is a second and a third stage. And so the second stage will be, not everyone will go to the second stage. It'll usually be more reserved for people who have been to treatment before or they think need more support. And the second stage will be like a kind of half step into the community. So you'll still live at the center, you will still do programming at the center, all that kind of stuff, but you'll also, your afternoons, your evenings, you'll have the freedom to leave and like go out. And usually the expectation with those sorts of things is you're going to things like meetings or meeting with counselors, or perhaps you might be looking into jobs or volunteering or whatever. But the point is that you still live at the treatment center, you still have the support of the treatment center, but you're also integrating into the community. And then a lot of times treatment centers will then have a third stage, which oftentimes will look something more like a sober home, where you're no longer really in treatment anymore, but you now live in like kind of like what I did, honestly, where you live in like a house that has some level of oversight and certainly has rules around like no drug use. People have to maintain sobriety. Usually has rules around like, you have to attend this number of meetings or other sorts of support groups or whatever, this amount a week and this sort of thing. But otherwise, you're pretty much free. Like, you're no longer beholden to any sort of treatment structure. Okay. You live in sort of like a boarding house with these sorts of rules. And otherwise, you can go to school, work, have your own sort of free time and all that kind of stuff. So
it's really like a gradual entry into society.
And all my claims will always be kind of like anecdotal in terms of like my experience in terms of like success or what works or what doesn't work. But generally speaking, the longer someone is in treatment and the more kind of staged gradual integration there is and supportive integration there is, the more successful they're going to be, right? Like 30-day, it's pretty well known in the treatment world that like a 30-day treatment centers have very low success rates, right?
Okay.
And treatment in general has quite a low success rate. It's really hard for people to, and I saw working there, it's very hard for people to go from such a controlled, supportive environment. And treatment is you build a lot of really close relationships in treatment. It's really kind of personal. The people that you're there with, you get to know them super well. People get super close. It's very supportive. And so, going from that sort of environment right back to where you started, most times people are not successful. Yeah,
you're tossed in the deep end.
No, you're tossed back in the deep end. And even if there is some sort of like follow-up support, like, you see a counselor once a week or you're gonna go to meetings or whatever, suddenly all that support, that's kind of like enveloped you, the community is kind of gone. And a lot of times, if people are returning back into the spaces that they were at before, well, they're returning to the same sorts of issues, right? That was related to their substance use, right? Whether that's like, difficulties in their relationship or their job or other traumas they have or, whatever stressors. And, if it's the same sort of environment, well, like, they might know their dealer's phone number, they might know where their dealer lives, or, you know what I mean? So you're forced back into this space that was hard to stay sober in to begin with, or where you were active in your addiction. And, so you're thrown from treatment back into that world. Your chances aren't very good. And so seeing, people go from something that's very intensive, like inpatient, and then going like where I work with like something second stage where it's a little more freedom, but still lots of oversight, to moving to more freedom, but still some support. And a lot of times those sorts of processes would be like a year long. And, from my understanding and my experience of seeing people, the people who take, who go through treatment and treat it like a 6 month or a 9 month or a year or even more sort of thing, those people tend to be much more successful. The success rates seem to be much higher than like, just like a 2 week or a 1 month, I'm gonna go to treatment and then I'm gonna come right back to where I was. Though that generally doesn't work out. I mean, obviously there's outliers and people, do it successfully, but it's very low for sure.
When you started working in the Downtown Eastside, serving this community, was that at all like triggering for you, or like did you ever feel like tempted to kind of relapse? Did you ever relapse?
No. And the short answer on the I actually started working in more harm reduction oriented stuff before I started working at Downtown Eastside. So I was working, I went from working in a treatment center to working, I went from working in a treatment center to working in like a low barrier housing supportive unit in a different city. And so I kind of got exposure to working in a place where people were actively using. And that process was I remember it being a little bit difficult to begin with, but it was also, things had also changed a lot, right? Like by the time I started working in the field, fentanyl was everywhere. Heroin's not even a thing anymore. Like you can't even find it, or it's very difficult to find. Everybody's using fentanyl and tranquilizers and benzo dopes and all this kind of stuff, and methamphetamines and stuff, which was never really my thing. So like that world was just not very like appealing to me. Yeah. There was some early periods where I think it was a little bit of a struggle kind of being around people using again, but I pretty quickly got over that. Okay. And frankly, like working in spaces like Downtown Eastside and seeing people using and all that kind of stuff, it's not really particularly like inviting. Yeah. Like it's pretty intense. It's a pretty like intense and like grueling and quite upsetting space and world to be in. And the substances that people are using aren't like, they don't look to be particularly like enjoyable in many kind of ways. So yeah, it was never really like a huge like, oh, I feel like I'm gonna use or whatever too. I mean, I'll speak freely on the video. You may or may not want to put this in, but like I don't consider myself to be someone who's like totally like sober. Any like more like I use like cannabis products and stuff like that. Yeah. And we'll have the occasional drink or whatever. Yeah. But that was something that happened like I was like totally off everything for like 6 or 7 years. Yeah. And then like, and then I've like started using like, cannabis gummies and those sorts of things. Yeah. And that's been fine. One thing I've kind of really noticed that I think has some literature to back it up a little bit, again, it's kind of up in the air, is this, like, do people have more general substance use issues, or are people have attractions to particular substances, right? Yeah. Like, and what I found, my personal experience with myself and with other people that I've known, is it seems that people seem to be pretty substance specific, right? Yeah, like people either are really into down or they're really into like uppers, like cocaine or methamphetamine or whatever. Oftentimes those two will kind of overlap. Or like the other big one that I know and I saw a lot working in treatment centers is alcohol. Like people will specifically be into drinking alcohol, and like they've tried other drugs, they've done other stuff, but it doesn't matter, it just doesn't do it for them. It's just pills, right? And the same thing with like things like opioid. And like for me, I certainly think I'm someone where it was like opioids were definitely like, that was the kind of thing where it was like, if you're using opioids, like it's either on or it's off. Yeah. There's no like shifting there. Not that I would recommend or do like any other like hard substances, because I just don't think it's safe or a good idea for a large number of reasons. But I do think that there tends to be this, people tend to be pretty like specific about what they want to do. And even working in the downtown east side, I really saw people, there was definitely people who gravitated really specifically towards, say, something like meth, or gravitated really specifically to something like even tranquilizer dope. Like that's the only thing they wanted to do. And like they weren't really interested in doing meth or doing crack, or for example, like, or someone might be really in like crack is their thing and that's all they do, right? Yeah. And so it does seem to be that like, that people have some kind of like, that addiction tends to present itself in kind of somewhat substance-specific kind of manner, at least in what I've experienced both myself and particularly with the people that I've served over the years and worked with.
I watched a video recently, and I don't know if there's actually any evidence to back this up, but it makes kind of sense to me. But I saw a video that was explaining that people with different, I guess, like personality types are attracted to things. Like, for example, people with ADHD are very attracted to crystal meth because it almost like helps them to focus in. People that are very introverted or secluded tend to also like stimulants like crack cocaine or crystal meth, because it helps them kind of break free from that thing. And people with trauma tend to go towards alcohol or opiates because it helps them kind of escape.
And I think that there's I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. And like, obviously there's overlap, and polysubstance use is a big thing. But it also tends to be a big thing within, like, we'll talk within like the downtown east side. We're talking specifically like most people in the downtown east side that I would work with, they're using some form of down. And when I say down, that's a generalized term for like some kind of opioid, tranq, benzo mix. Now it could be like just fentanyl, it could be heavily on the tranq side, it could be like heavily on the benzo side, but it's usually fentanyl either on its own or mixed with tranquilizers and benzos on some kind of level. And on the downtown east side, the vast majority of what people are using, what I would see would be a mix of some down and side. And side is is street term for methamphetamine. I think though that a lot of times the methamphetamine is more there to kind of like keep people going. It's almost like kind of like a survival. It's also cheap. It's comparatively speaking, it's very inexpensive. And so it kind of like keeps people like awake and alive and moving, especially living on the street. Like it's sort of like a super energy drink, right? Also suppresses things like appetite stuff, so if you don't have access to food and all that kind of thing. And then the down tends to be more of the like primary focus for people, especially people who are deeply like traumatized and stuff that you're saying. But yeah, that's the really common one, is that at this point is down and side together that people are using.
So you mentioned that you had a gradual, I guess, re-entry to using some alcohol here and there, or cannabis, whether it's gummies or
I don't like alcohol.
At
all, really. Yeah.
I think like a common theme or narrative that is pushed is that cannabis and alcohol can act as kind of like gateway substances. Yeah. You think that there's any truth to that?
I would say the answer to that now is no.
No.
And I would say that largely because like, okay, let me talk about cannabis first. I'd say the answer to cannabis now is no. Yeah. Because we're talking here in Vancouver, BC, and cannabis is legal. Yeah. And I think that in most cases, like I know a lot of, especially like I'm a millennial, I know a lot more millennials that use cannabis products, like on some form of regularity, than alcohol.
Yeah.
And it seems to be much less intrusive and effects, like much less have like much less negative effects on like the life and whatever, right? Now, I do think though that if like you're rolling the clock back to a time when you're buying cannabis illegally and you're operating with dealers and things like that, there can be some argument to be made for like, well, if you're having to buy from drug dealers and you're in that kind of world, well, now you're getting exposure to other substances because you're having to buy from someone who might also sell other stuff or has access to other stuff or whatever. Alcohol, I do think, is a little bit different, largely because of the way that alcohol, like when people drink, what happens, right? Like a really common combination is like alcohol and cocaine, right? Like alcohol, it's a party drug. People party, like people don't like. I don't go to parties and raves and things like that, but I know people that do. And like alcohol is a big part of that, but also a lot of party drugs are a big part of that. So that's like where people get exposure to things like MDMA or cocaine or whatever. And alcohol also lowers your inhibitions. So like, I think people are probably more likely to, if someone's like, hey, you want to do some coke, or hey, you want to try this pill or whatever, and they're already drunk, they're probally more likely to say yes.
Totally.
And so I think that like there's probably some level of argument, but I don't think that either one is a particularly like big marker or like, like I don't really prescribe to the great gateway drug theory very much at all.
Same here.
And I think too, like reflecting back on my own childhood, like one of the reasons, or one of my own experience, one of the reasons I don't prescribe that is because I like knew for myself, and it seemed like a lot of the other youth that I was associating with at the time were all pretty self-motivated to find substances. It wasn't like you're taught in like DARE and all these things where it's like, some sketchy kid at school is like, hey man, I'm gonna make you take this like drug or whatever, right? Like the people, like both myself and the other kids that I knew who had substance use issues, everyone was pretty personally motivated to find substances and do X, Y, Z, right? So like, I don't think cannabis was the reason that they like did that. I think that there is something about people who have experienced trauma or whatever it might be, or who have just some high predilection to substance abuse where like they just instinctually want to push the envelope. And I think a lot of times too, that's paired with that sort of like teenage, adolescent period where you are kind of more impressionable, emotionally unstable. You're curious. Your decision making powers are not as good, and all that kind of stuff as well too, right? So like you're just more apt to make poor choices when you're like in that world where like you're hanging out with other teens and they're like, hey, you want to try like crack or whatever, and it's like a teen is more likely to say sure because they're like badder at making decisions. Like, it's basically the bottom line, right? Like, and I don't think that it's necessarily like cannabis, alcohol that are going to like institute those things. And then I also think too that like the most severe cases that I saw of other teens getting involved with substances, a lot of times had to do with their environment as well. Like again, it wasn't like cannabis, alcohol, it was the fact that like their parents were also addicts, right? Or they had siblings that were using, or like, their neighborhood was like really bad, and like other people were using in the building with them and all that. And so they just had exposure already to more severe stuff, and that's how they started using it, right? Like, that would be my kind of answer to that, basically.
Okay. Well, I want to ask you some more questions about what it's like to work in the downtown Eastside and serve this community, because I'm sure you have tons of stories. But why don't we end this portion of this right now, and then we'll continue this in part 2.